think.
But it's the ability to bring those voters with you.
It's complicated and you don't need to worry about it.
It's been very well canvassed that as a party, we don't think the way that Darlene acted was in line with our values and principles.
I really had to think about, how am I going to change things up? How am I going to get through this? Because I don't want to fail.
It is foul and personal and violent.
Job is to make sure that we are showing New Zealanders that there is an alternative to the divisive approach of this government, that you can bring people together.
I mean, I think one of the things that any government of whatever stripe has to realise that every minister has to be a climate minister now.
When you've got a country that's got a young population but they don't get involved, you might want to have a grown-up chat about that.
We don't want a situation where government dictates the local government, but you want to make sure the system is set up so that it's easy for communities to make a decision.
I'd be really interested to see if the officials that advise that a Crown Observer was necessary or should be put in place, or whether he's made that judgment call himself.
I don't think we did, and I've said this, I don't think, because it happened quite quickly last time, I don't know that we did a good enough job of bringing the public with us.
Remember, just by having Maori Wars doesn't guarantee that mana whenua are going to be represented around the table.
Suggests that whānau with a disability and those who care and support them are somehow grifters.
Hello there, kia ora.
There's so much crap going on this week that we have to split this in half.
There's crap going on every week. The news this week's about 15 minutes long. It's not a short one with everything that was to put in there.
I was referring to the fact that we've had to split this in half, but yes, the news is not good either.
It's all good. So just a couple of little quick bits of housekeeping before we get started. The first couple of guests that we've got, Ricardo and Lawrence, we'll be doing that live. If people want to ask questions in the chat, they're more than welcome to do that, and we'll try and get to them. I can't guarantee we're going to get to all of them, but we will do our best. We've got a pre-recorded interview with Professor Shaun Hendy coming up after that. It goes for about 35 minutes, and then the news. We're running a poll on the YouTube page at the moment, just asking how people are feeling about the upcoming budget. Do you think the budget's going to be great? I don't know anybody who thinks that, or you can't imagine how it could be any worse, or you can see now why people are leaving the country in record numbers. It's available on the YouTube page now for people to do if they want to. Anything else I need to add? Fire exits, fast breaks?
No, and just a reminder, we will be back for part 2 tomorrow night. And it's
Yeah, so tomorrow night from 7:30, we've got Jan Tanetti here. So we'll have a chat to her about the pay equity stuff as well. So there's a lot going on. And then next week, we've got Priyanka Radhakrishnan joining us on the Friday after the budget to have a talk about how the budget is hurting specifically disabled communities. And, well, everybody else, because I think everybody at this stage fears it's going to be one of those budgets that hurts everyone. Should we ask the expert?
Yeah. So here to talk about the alternative budget is Ricardo Menendez March and Lawrence Xu-Nan.
Kia ora, everybody.
Hey, kia ora.
Kia ora. Good to be back. Good to see the two of you, Paul and Blake.
Yeah. Now, I actually have a completely non-political question to start off with first. Wintergeddon's coming up. You guys tend to do this together with group costumes. What is this year's costume?
We haven't confirmed yet. There are definitely a couple of options. So last year, Ricardo, Tiana, and myself went as Star Trek characters, specifically as slightly anachronistic, but Spock, Picard, and Kirk. We haven't quite figured out where we're going to go this year yet.
Okay, that's fair. How do you work it out? What's the process? Just like, this would be kind of cool. This is what we're watching at the moment.
It's what's available.
Okay.
It's what's available. It's who we can get. I personally, and this is not official, and this is not, I personally at some stage would love to see Malama dress as Storm. So,
Yeah, that could work. See, Ricardo, I think you do really well as Cassian Andor.
Oh, you're not the first one to suggest this. But yeah.
Throwing it out there.
Watch this space. Watch this space.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun. Hey, budget day. The government budget obviously comes out Thursday, and most people seem to be sensing a feeling of dread with it. The sort of feedback that we've had beforehand has been, this is getting cut, that's getting cut. We've got to give tax cuts to landlords and tobacco companies.
Again.
You guys released an alternative budget this week. Now, I had to sit down and watched Chloe's presentation last night of it. It shocked me to hear a politician talking about hope, because it's not something that we hear a lot of these days. I'm kind of curious, what are your guys' impressions of this alternative budget and the feedback that you've had on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think our alternative budget shows that a different vision for Aotearoa is possible, one where we have basic services adequately funded. And as you'll see, what we're proposing, particularly on top of things like increasing income support to lift families out of poverty, interregional rail, and things that you would have seen us announce before, we've also launched our vision for free publicly owned GP services and adequately resourcing the primary care sector, as well as bringing ECE as well into away from it being treated as a for-profit business and it being free as well. And this is because we think, this is what tax is for. It's actually to have functioning services we can all access to be well, rather than to give tax breaks to landlords and to, fund things that actually don't make everyday people's lives better.
Yeah, and this is on a lot of these kind of core public goods and services is something that Aotearoa New Zealand have had in the past, and they've been kind of withered away over years. And I think it's really obvious that this government is sort of playing New Zealanders for fools into trying to make people believe that we don't deserve the best.
Last week, the head of the New Zealand initiative jumped on, I think it must have been ZB with Ryan Bridges, and was talking about what he calls asset recycling, because he knows the term asset sales are a really triggering term for a lot of people. And his theory was basically, if we have this asset and we sell it, we get the money, and then we can do what the Greens want to do and rebuild up the public infrastructure and make sure we've got all these things again that we can then sell off again later for more money. How do you protect that from happening?
Well, I mean, we just don't support asset sales. I think this is what we've got in our green alternative budget, a pretty robust set of revenue gathering exercises, which will leave 9 out of 10 New Zealanders paying less tax. And this is about shifting the burden of tax away from income tax to wealth. And so I think we can build up the assets that we all own to also deliver public services that we all need to use, as opposed to treating things like primary health as a business for profit, which is something that we're seeing. I don't know in your local neighborhoods, but what we receive feedback from is a lot of the GP-owned clinics that would have been sort of community-led being bought up by corporates. And this shows that the current model that we have is just not working. And the fact that, for example, setting up a GP clinic is more profitable when you do it, for example, near a wealthy retirement village, as opposed to low-income communities where the need is there the most, shows as well that we need a complete change in how we do primary health. And so our plan is comprehensive in that regard to address all those things.
And I think in terms of asset sales, let's not beat around the bush and call it asset recycling. In terms of asset sales, it's a complete distraction from the fact that we have everything we need here in Aotearoa if we actually do, everyone pay their fair share of tax. Because frankly, people who are on PAYE, people who are just working your 9 to 5 are already doing that. Yet we don't see the same for the top 311 richest, wealthiest families in Aotearoa, who combined have a total of more assets than, the bottom 50% of people here in Aotearoa. So, but the other side of that is the asset sales we've seen over the last 4 decades. Let's face it, a lot of things we think of, banking, for example, no longer owned here in Aotearoa. It's precisely the reason we're in this mess in the first place, because if for people who want to make a profit, why would they buy something if it wasn't for the fact it's profitable? Corporations, international corporations, don't do things out of the goodness of their heart. So if there are things to be gained, why are we not prioritizing our own people?
So I was doing the calculator before we came on here to prepare for the interview tonight. So we were looking at, I was looking at the calculator results, and it told me that as a disabled person, I would receive around $650 a week in your plan, and that's pretty astonishing, really, compared to what we have now. So, but the problem is, there's no, and I'm trying to ask the question, but there's no guarantee that you'll govern by yourselves. So if you don't govern on your own, how will you make sure that new benefit system once again gets into your coalition agreement?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why our message to voters is: if you want to see these policies, you got to vote for us. And the more votes we get by the time we get to the negotiating table, the stronger hand we'll have when it comes to forcing Labor to adopt our policies. We in this MMP environment, it's rare, and we saw Labor last time almost having a once in a generation opportunity to wield power alone, and I would say they wasted that opportunity. But my point being is that normally you'd be sitting down with other political parties to negotiate. The better our vote, the higher the chance. And I also think it's time Labor moves away from defending the status quo around having benefit sanctions, about forcing disabled people to prove their disability time and time again to continue receiving income support. I also think the onus is on Labor to stop fiddling around the center and be brave.
Yeah, and we have already seen, in this term's government that, the Green Party is the third biggest party in parliament right now. And what we're seeing is parties which is far smaller than us being able to have the kind of influence on government decisions through, coalition agreements, etc. So I think, like what Ricardo said, and I think this is something that if people like what we put out there and think that, that actually there is hope, and we can hope, and we deserve hope, and to hope and to dream, then that this is something for people to consider next year.
Ricardo, we were texting during the social services debate the other day, and I commended you on your speech, and
thank you,
and a lot of that. So, as you mentioned in your speech, how damaging could this new policy that's passing be for our community right now?
Yeah, so the government has just passed 4 new benefit sanctions and turned them into law. They also passed in that piece of legislation forcing beneficiaries to reapply for benefits twice as often, so basically each 6 months. The 4 benefit sanctions are going to be really harmful because the government is calling them non-financial. And I'll give an example of one called compulsory money management, which will force people to put 50% of their income on a payment card. And they want to be able to access hardship grants while they're on that so-called non-financial sanction, which makes no sense to me, because if you're calling it non-financial sanction and then you can't access financial assistance, that seems like it contradicts the point. But we do know that most people on the benefit are spending more than 50% of their income on rent. MSD themselves showed that to us. And so what I'm really concerned about is that these benefit sanctions will just keep pushing people more into poverty. And also because of the way that the government has designed these new sanctions, basically it's easier to get sanctioned now, basically. It's called the obligation failure account, which it's a little bit technical, but all I'm saying is that work and income will have more opportunities now over a period of time to strip you away of income support than they did before, resulting in more people living in the streets without income support, taking debt just to survive. And we saw that in the junkie years of people living in cars. I don't think we should be accepting, growing homelessness as a price to pay for tax cuts for landlords.
Final question from me on this section before we move on to something else. Do you feel like Minister Upton is starting to listen to you with all the arguments you're having in the House, Ricardo?
I think the better question is she listening or hearing?
Yeah, I think she's listening to me. I just think she cares. I don't think she cares. This is part of the problem. I mean, like, you know, how can you imagine that maybe the issue is that she just hasn't read the reports or the evidence when, like, even the ministry has shown her the harm that these policies will do? And I think this is actually, like, I find it in some ways freeing to accept that actually she doesn't care. Because in some ways it shows us that what we need is a change of government, not to keep pleading to this minister that, you know, maybe if she just reads one more report about how benefit sanctions don't work, she'll just, you know, open her eyes and change her mind. And in some ways that shifts my focus away from talking not to the minister but to the communities. And I think there's more power in talking to the communities than to the minister at the moment.
Shall we talk about the Privileges Committee, Paul?
Well, I think the Privileges Committee is a really important thing to talk about because it is done behind closed doors, and Ricardo, you are on that committee. I'm very curious about the process that led to the report that we saw this week that's recommended the longest ever time to suspend MPs from the House. It is 7 times the longest period that's ever been handed out before. The report's been tabled now, so I'm kind of curious from both of you what your perspective is on what the report said versus what you saw in the House when you were there versus, you know, the feedback that you've been getting from the public.
Yeah, I mean, it's frankly bullcrap. I mean, I think this is completely disproportionate. I'm really disappointed in the fact that there wasn't a proper consensus decision-making, you know, process as part of this, which is kind of how it's supposed to be in this committee. I do think the procedures were incredibly partisan, and we've got to remember that this punishment is basically preventing the voters of those 3 electorates from being represented in events like the government's budget, and it's also stripping away those 3 MPs from having salaries for those 3 weeks as well. More importantly, I think this shows a complete lack of willingness from the government members to acknowledge that we do need to review basically the rules of the House. Like, we do have to make these determinations with the existing rules. I do think there should have been some space to pause the proceedings and actually have that mature conversation we need to have around tikanga in Parliament. And why is it that, you know, these politicians are really comfortable with the haka being used in stadiums, being used in concerts, being used in all these things, like as a tool to sell, as opposed to as a cultural expression that I think was massively appropriate in the context of the Treaty Principles Bill. I also think we're going to be heading into a really interesting debate on Tuesday as we debate the report, and that could be prolonged for quite some time. I just want to pass on to Lawrence because he's probably the best one to explain just a bit of what's going to be happening on Tuesday, and you may have seen some media reports about it already.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that Ricardo has highlighted, and we are now seeing sort of with alarming frequency with this particular government, is committees that is traditionally non-partisan, is reasonably built on consensus, has been overridden by the majority, which is the government. So that includes the Privileges Committee, but it also includes the Regulations Review Committee in terms of the tikanga regulations. So that is, again, something that we have noticed. That is something that is supposed to be non-partisan and being partisan. But, you know, in the broader context, you're also seeing a government that has triggered urgency more frequently and more flippantly than any other previous government. There's a very specific set of criteria of how you trigger urgency. But for example, we're looking at last week in terms of both the Wildlife Amendment Bill as well as the Pay Equity Amendment Bill, those are not, strictly speaking, fulfill the requirement of urgency. So what we are seeing is also a government that is just drooling over the authoritarian regimes and is trying to dictate what is what the fundamental constitutional arrangement of Aotearoa, which is based on democracy, but it's not actually allowing people to have that say. In terms of the process itself, like Ricardo said, one of the things in the debate, when a motion is raised or a proposal is raised, this allows every single member an opportunity to debate on that for up to 10 minutes. However, the requirement is that you need to be sticking very closely to the motion that is raised, in this case, to do with the 3 MPs who are suspended, and that is to do with the way that standing orders is currently works, and that's standing orders 2552. And the way that it works, it allows each person to have a debate. You have to stick very closely to that. But however, people can also propose amendment on those debates, as I think it is Standing Orders 124 to 130, but which then resets the debating cycle. Because although you're only allowed to debate it once, but then you're allowed to debate it again if the amendment has been proposed, but you can only speak on that particular amendment, and you can only do it once. So you can get into this sort of a bit of a rhythm, a bit of a cycle, but I think there is a level of nuance that is required when we do that, because the speaker, for one, will be looking very closely at the party's ability to bring in new material.
Basically, we could be there for many, many hours, or potentially more than a day, debating this.
Yeah. Delay the budget.
Hard to tell. Like it could, but I think it's going to be a hard thing to get to. But that is our job as opposition as well, is to make sure that the government cannot push forward their agenda, and particularly when the government is going through terrible lawmaking. We have a sense of duty to make sure we use every tool at our disposal to prevent the government from continuing to introduce more terrible legislation. And I just saying the comments about the amendments Lawrence moved on the pay equity bill, and that's part of it. It is to make a political point, but it is also because we don't want to give the government a chance to introduce more terrible legislation. And the government has an onus and a responsibility to also answer to our amendments, to our questions, and to the points that we're raising when we're debating bills in the committee of the whole House. I would say Lawrence is probably the best person in Parliament when it comes to being able to hold a really, really long time in the debating chamber. I recommend watching his contributions in committee of the whole House.
It is fantastic to watch. It is really fantastic to watch. With the pay equity bill itself, I managed to catch up with you and Chloe last week, Ricardo, about this. How much feedback have you guys had in the last week over those changes? And about the distraction techniques that we've seen this week that have cropped up from the coalition trying to steer people away from talking about it?
The feedback's been massive. It's really clear that, people are realizing that this government is not just anti-workers, they're anti-women, they're anti-low-paid workers. I think, and frankly, Labour played a bit into it, unfortunately, but, distraction politics is absolutely coming into play when it comes to the use of the C word, and the sort of like performative outrage over this, particularly coming from Winston Peters, and politicians claiming that, the House is chaos when he's actually the one who tends to be the most disruptive in question time. So I'm not here for the performative outrage from the government politicians. We've got a job to do. We've got to fight for good incomes, good housing, and women being able to get pay equity. I'm not here to talk about politicians' level of comfort with the C word.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, and this is something that I think for the Greens we hold very close to our heart, is the clear understanding of the role that we play, but we only play a very small part of a much bigger system. And the fact that, politicians, and even including things with before talking about Minister Upson, politicians and ministers come and go, but some of the institutions and people's lived experience have endured, for a long time. And for us, it's really humbling when we are able to actually voice and channel what people are saying at the community level in the House. And that's for us what our purpose and what our position is. But I think, we just went to a protest. It's been protests happening for 2 weeks now. And there's just been a protest today at the University of Auckland, just outside the General Library with PSA and TEU. And they were talking about, they were literally going to be making some form of agreement. And the negotiation was supposed to be coming to a close this week with Universities New Zealand in terms of the librarians, but also the admin staff in terms of pay equity. And that's all gone out the window because, frankly, employers do not play nice when it comes to something like this. And one of the other things that we have done this week when we were questioning the Minister for Workplace Relations during the annual review, and you can see that there was a bit of fumbling when we asked her, look, how much, what is the estimate for the cost if, let's say, hypothetically speaking, all 3 pay equity claims were settled? And she was initially like, oh, well, we can't do that because of budget sensitivity. But I'm like, no. The Prime Minister said very carefully that this is not relevant to the budget, in which case you can disclose the estimate as of December 2024. So there was a bit of uncomfortableness for her to disclose.
And it's important for people to know that, there's all this discourse about not comparing librarians to engineers, whatever the ACT Party in New Zealand First is saying. But like, the government ministers will be getting a pay rise. And how the pay rise is calculated is literally comparing the government ministers' jobs to other jobs, like including like jobs that could be like completely unrelated, like in terms of like, but could have comparable skills, comparable, bits. And so I think it's so rich that the government ministers are quite happy to take a pay rise calculated by, a method that it is not completely dissimilar to something like what we do in pay equity. And yet they're saying to low-income women that this is not possible and that we shouldn't make it happen. It's also bloody rich for the government members to be saying that pay equity remains when they're forcing countless and countless of women to restart the process and to set the bar a lot higher, making it harder for people to apply. It's, I think, a complete attack on higher wages, and they're assuming that we'll just receive the trickle-down benefits of landlords getting richer.
Trickle down and downward pressure and all those fancy terms that don't actually mean anything. It's ridiculous. On Thursday, on the 22nd, there is a hui planned for outside of Parliament on the Parliament grounds by a couple of the unions. I've been told very carefully to make sure that we use the term hui or rally. We are not to use another term because they are under negotiation with government at the moment, so there's rules around what some of these organizations can do. Are you guys intending on being there for that?
I hope so. I mean, obviously pending our responsibilities inside of that building, but yeah, like kia kaha to everyone holding a hui on the 22nd. And more than anything, I also want to encourage people who may have never belonged to a union to show up to the protest rallies hui across the country to show solidarity for the workers that we're hoping to get pay equity and to be paid what they deserve.
And I think that's the threatening factor for any right-wing government is that they have strength in money, but not strength in numbers. So one of the things that they would tend to do is a divide and conquer tactic. So I think when we're looking at something like this, it actually doesn't just affect low-paying workers. It actually doesn't just affect, female workers. It actually affects a lot of people. As a parent, it affects your children's ability to learn from someone, and because it affects the teacher's pay and etc. So we have to think of things as we're all part of this community, this large community, and we should all find a way to support each other.
As we finish, what do you think of Minister Bishop's video from the other day saying the opposition is lying and etc., and he was brave enough to put it out on TikTok and etc.
I mean, I think he's projecting. A former tobacco lobbyist who relied on literally lying about the tobacco industry to make a living shouldn't be the one we should be taking lessons from or advice when it comes to accuracy or truth or caring about everyday people. Chris Bishop has been rolled out as the resident mansplainer for the National Party, and I just think it's pretty appalling that rather than actually working to make people's lives better, they're just working with spin. But what else can we expect from someone who literally was a spin expert for the tobacco industry, now in a government giving tax breaks for the tobacco companies?
Yeah. And I have, to be honest, we've spent a lot of our time these last few weeks actually hearing from people who have been affected and then working out on ways how we can, make the change and support the people. I have no time to entertain, criticism on his attempt to distract the public.
Yeah.
I've got a question here that's actually come in on one of the other channels about the budget again, if you don't mind us just jumping back to this one. It's specifically around the budget in relation to disability. The person who sent the message just found it kind of dense. Some people have trouble being able to concentrate on numbers. I'm one of those, I hate numbers. Numbers do my head in. She'd like to know what in your budget is going to be there for making things like accessible housing more accessible for people, or looking at housing standard changes to make it more commonplace to build accessible housing for people, and whether or not things like, it's a big long list here, disability equipment and modification would be brought back in under your budget that's been fairly heavily restricted under the current government, and enabling good lives, what your stance is on that.
Yeah, we absolutely support enabling good lives. And just on the housing stuff, we'll be releasing our fiscal strategy shortly, which should enable us to actually adequately resource kāinga ora to build enough homes to end the public housing waiting list. But we've long had a commitment that kāinga ora should be building way more houses with universal design that are fully accessible. It's not just the right thing to do. It's also cheaper, actually, to build homes accessible from the get-go rather than retrofitting later down the line. So absolutely, this has been a continuous. And when I held a public housing portfolio last term, this was one of the areas I would also support Jen Logie to push on. So yeah, we've remained committed to ensuring more of the public housing stock is fully accessible, because no one should find their home as basically as a barrier, and any of us could become disabled, and therefore we need homes that can support us from the cradle to the grave, no matter our disability.
And also one of the things that's in our budget is, and we have done this in the past, we have talked about this in the past as well, which is to transform ACC into agency for comprehensive care, which then also includes things like chronic illness and disability and additional health conditions, because we actually think that ACC is in the best position to be able to provide those kind of holistic care and I guess support that actually will allow people to live with dignity.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to finish. So thank you, gentlemen, for coming back on the show and coming through your alternative budget with us. It was very enjoyable.
Kia ora koroa. Thank you for having us.
Thank you both. Good to see the two of you.
I will catch you guys probably in a couple of weeks.
No doubt.
So I take brilliant costumes.
I'll try to live to the expectations.
You've seen what they have. You don't have to aim too high. There's as long as you have fun with it.
That's right.
We always do. Yeah.
Awesome.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate it.
See you
All
later.
right. Bye.
Cheers. Now I've got like a mozzie floating around in front of me.
So
it's ridiculous.
Is that you confirming that you're going to advocate with the green?
Yeah. I've been pondering it for the last few days, and then I'm just like, you know what? I don't need to buy anything. My partner has actually been very specific and told me I'm not allowed any more swords. Apparently 2 real swords, a 3D printed sword, and a lightsaber are too many.
Yep, too many swords.
No such thing. Definitely no such thing. Hey, before we jump on to the interview with Shaun Hendy, I just want to say a massive thank you to JK Just Saying for the super chat. This is huge. I don't know what drink I'm going to get for $50, but I'm going to try and find something. But I am going to Asia in a couple of months where $50 will get me like the entire bar. So that'll come in handy. So thank you very much, JK. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Alcohol very cheap in Asia.
Well, everything's very cheap in the parts that I'm going to. But I'm taking my mother for her 65th birthday present, so I'm sure we can find something very, very nice for her to drink.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
On that note, recently we got to catch up with Shaun Hendy about his time in the COVID era doing modelling for the government, and here's our little chat with him. Well, not little, it's like 35 minutes long. But
yeah, it's a 35-minute long chat with Shaun. I found this really fascinating because obviously during COVID, everybody was sort of locked down and did their own thing. So it was really fascinating to see from his perspective, right from the start all the way through to the point where they're all dealing with burnout and getting exhausted by everything that's going on. It was, really fascinating. But I won't spoil the end. Well, I'll just hit the button and everybody else can watch it instead.
Yeah. Shaun Hendy was one of the leading COVID voices during our COVID pandemic in New Zealand. And now he's released a new book, The COVID Response, all about it. He's here to talk about it with us. Andy joins us now. Hi, Shaun. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Kia ora, Blake. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's go right back. So you had the pleasure of helping out the Labour administration that was in during COVID. How did that work for you, and how did that inspire you to write this book?
Yeah, it was a little bit of an accident actually that we ended up working on the COVID response. It wasn't working on infectious disease wasn't one of my main activities as a researcher. I was an academic at the University of Auckland, and I was leading a research centre called Te Pūnaha Matatini. And we worked on all sorts of different problems. And we had been doing a little bit of work on infectious disease. So we'd been involved in the Mycoplasma bovis program. Now that was a disease that entered the country sort of 2015, 2016, infected cattle and other livestock. And so we've been working with the Ministry of Primary Industries on that. But it wasn't kind of our main activity. And so we weren't necessarily expecting to be as involved in the COVID response as we were. We sort of dipped our toes in. I started working on some very simple models in March 2020. You remember, if you cast your mind back to February and March, we really didn't know a lot about this virus. It was a new one. We hadn't encountered it before. And so I started to do some very simple modeling using the data that I could see coming out of China and Italy. And very soon it became apparent that there weren't many other teams in New Zealand that could do that kind of work. And so we started fielding more and more requests. Could we do this? Could we do that? And by the end of March, those requests were coming in so frequently that it was almost our full-time job. As academics, you do have other things to do. You've got to teach your classes, and you've got your own research programs, etc. So it was quite difficult to start with, and we were lucky that a lot of our colleagues stepped up to help. One of my colleagues took over teaching my class in March, so that I didn't have to do that. And gradually we got more and more involved, and eventually I got a letter from the National Crisis Management Centre basically drafting me into the emergency response. That was it. I mean, if you told me a few weeks earlier that that would be kind of become my full-time job, I would have been very surprised. It was not something we'd necessarily prepared for. But we had the team that I had the mathematical skills to be able to develop those models. So it was a bit of a surprise. Looking back, I do feel really privileged to have been involved. It was a big crisis for New Zealand, and it's not often as a scientist you really get to see the impact of your work. A lot of us we beaver away at our science for decades, thinking that it'll be useful down the track, but not necessarily getting to see how useful it is. But one of the things with COVID was we often saw it being used within days, and that was really rewarding. And I think overall, when I look back, as on what happened. I think New Zealand had one of the best responses in the world, and quite proud to have been a part of that.
And then what made you decide to do this book? Because obviously your modelling ended up being world leading, so that's something to be very proud of. But you and people like Professor Baker, Sir Ashley Bloomfield, and others were thrust into the limelight, as you said. So what was the process of settling down from the COVID period and then writing this book?
Yeah, this is actually my fourth book. So as we got towards the end of the COVID era, people started asking me, "When's the book coming out, Shaun?" They were partly joking, but also there was kind of an expectation from my colleagues, my science colleagues, that I would write about it, because I think people in the science community realised how unusual it was to have science kind of right at the centre of decision making, and so people were kind of expecting me to write a book. I actually was first of all, coming out of the COVID, that COVID period, I was exhausted. So I didn't have a lot of energy to put into the book, and I was also a bit overwhelmed by the whole experience. Trying to make sense of it. I couldn't immediately make sense of it. Like, all the work we'd done, it took me a while to really get my head around it. And then in terms of writing a book, I really struggled to think, how am I going to do this when so many people contributed? How could I tell that story when I was just, I was one part. I mean, a very visible and prominent part of the response, but there were an enormous number of people involved behind the scenes as well. How could I sort of tell that story? And so I struggled with that for about a year. And then I think, I did think, well, it's important to leave a record for the next generation. We won't be the last group of scientists that has to confront a pandemic, unfortunately. And so I did want to leave that record. What are the things that we learnt along the way? What are the things we thought we got right? What are the things we thought we got wrong? I thought it was really important that I actually put that down on paper. And so I thought, I figured out that well, I can't tell the whole story. It's gonna take a professional historian to sort of sit down and really do that. So I can tell the story of what happened to me and the events that were happening around me that I had sort of direct contact with, and that was still a pretty good story. And so that's what I set out to do, and it still took me about 18 months. I started mid 2023 and handed over the first draft manuscript towards the end of last year, 2024. So it was a big project. It was quite a lot of work.
Finally, before I hand over to Paul to ask some questions, like you mentioned to Jack Tane recently in your interview for Q&A that Delta was one of the hardest things to go through in the whole pandemic. Why would you pick Delta as opposed to Omicron, the regular strain, or any of the other strains that we had?
Yeah, I mean, so Delta, I think, in my opinion, was the trickiest of the variants, and I mean, there's two reasons for it. I mean, over time, we saw the variants become more and more transmissible. So we had the Alpha variant, which we didn't really experience here in New Zealand, but which caused the big winter wave in the Northern Hemisphere. So over sort of December, January 2020, 2021, Alpha drove a big second wave in Europe and the US. And then Delta was even more transmissible than Alpha. And the thing about Delta, as well as its transmissibility, is it was much more severe in terms of the outcome for people. So it killed a much higher proportion of people than the original strain. And then Omicron came along, and while it was much more transmissible, it was a milder strain. So it still It was still dangerous, but not nearly as dangerous as Delta, and slightly less deadly than the original strain. And the variants that we've seen since have all been in that Omicron family. So it seems to have settled into this pattern. So from my perspective, that was the one that was the riskiest. And of course, it made it through our MIQ somehow. We still don't know exactly how it did. Got into the community in Auckland. We were really, really unlucky that there was a big super spreading event before we were even aware that there had been an outbreak. There were hundreds and hundreds of people infected. There'd been a big church service where several hundred people had become infected. And so it was, at that point, it was really out of control. Alert level 4 did a pretty good job actually containing it. But unfortunately, it got into some of the poorer parts of the community in Auckland and some of the gangs. And essentially the contract tracers were no longer able to close it out. So it really did get away from us. And then we had to rely on vaccination to really get our way out of what could have been quite a serious outbreak.
Cool. I'll hand over to Paul.
You mentioned before things that we did well and things that we didn't do well. Hindsight, of course, is one of these things that's absolutely brilliant, gives you 20/20 vision. What do you look back on and go, yeah, we did this really well? And what do you look back on and go, we could have done this better?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we did really well was when we all got together and acted as a community. And I think that was particularly, that community spirit was particularly apparent during that first lockdown. The country really was quite united around that goal. And we did extremely well as a country, right? The very few other countries were able to do what we did, and that alert level 4 was very, very effective because basically people bought in and they followed the rules and looked after one another. So I think that's something we can look back on and be really proud as a country. I mean, one of the things that did go wrong was I think our reluctance to prioritise Māori and Pacific people for vaccination. That was quite early on. I mean, one of the things about COVID-19, and this still applies to the variants that we face today, is if you've got an underlying condition, diabetes or heart disease or hypertension, for example, you're at much higher risk of dying or having a severe course of the disease. And we knew that was much more prevalent in the Māori and Pacific Island population. And so there was a strong case for prioritising vaccination in Māori and Pacific people. One of the reasons that these underlying conditions are more prevalent in the Māori and Pacific Island population is they have less access to healthcare overall. We know that's a problem for those communities, and that meant that vaccination was going to be harder, right? It was going to be harder to deliver that to those communities, and so there should have been a dedicated effort, I think, to vaccinate Māori and Pacific people. And that's one of the reasons why we had to hang on for so long in that Delta lockdown in Auckland, is because the consequences of letting Delta get out of control in the Māori and Pacific population, which had not, their vaccination rates had fallen behind as many people thought they would, could have been quite severe. So I definitely think that was one of the big mistakes. And then, I think every time, if I look back and I kind of reflect on this a little bit in the book, every time we kind of got into an us and them situation where people were blaming each other for things going wrong, I think things went, our performance deteriorated. It really, the times that we did well is when we all banded together and worked towards a single goal. And when we started pointing fingers at one another for things going wrong, that undermined the response. So that my general conclusion was the most important, the biggest lesson for people facing future pandemics is that you've really got to face it as a community. You shouldn't be dividing the population in any way.
Now, speaking of dividing the population, the vaccines, when they came out, scared a lot of people because they don't understand the science or what had been leading up to the vaccines coming out when they did. From your perspective, how much of a game changer was that vaccine when it first came out? And were there any issues with the fact that it seemed to take a little bit longer to get the vaccine to New Zealand than it did for other parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, so it was really exciting when we got those first results for the mRNA vaccine. New Zealand we'd sort of laid a bet. I think we had four different vaccines that we'd arranged pre-purchase agreements for, but the vaccines that were showing the most effectiveness were the new mRNA technologies, and just people still might not fully understand it. But mRNA is what it's a copy of our DNA that our cells use to manufacture proteins within our cells. So, and the virus, the coronavirus that we were dealing with, its genes are actually coded in RNA, and so the mRNA that was in the vaccine was actually a piece of RNA that was in the virus, and it told our cells to manufacture one of the proteins that makes up the virus. So it was basically acting like a virus in us, and manufacturing a piece of that virus, and that allowed our immune system to recognize the virus when it entered our bodies and stop us from getting infected. In fact, the early on, against the earlier variants, right up until Delta, was actually very, very effective in entirely blocking infection. So that if you've been vaccinated, you're actually protected against infection entirely. And that meant that you wouldn't pass it on to other people. Even if you had a mild infection, you were less likely to pass it on to other people. So it was a game changer. And we were really lucky to have that technology, I think, this pandemic. And in terms of the delivery, I know it was really contentious at the time. And yeah, we weren't in the first batch of countries that got the vaccine. I mean, there are a number of things that meant that we were never going to be. Like there wasn't much we could do about that. I mean, one is that we don't manufacture our own vaccines in New Zealand. We're too small a country to do that. It's not cost effective for us to do that. And so we didn't have any manufacturing capacity ourselves. And many of the countries that did get the vaccine early did have that capacity. And so, it makes sense. It's understandable why those countries would have said, hang on a minute, we're not going to start exporting this vaccine into our own population has got it. There were some countries that did deals to get early access to the vaccine. So Israel was one of those countries. It basically did it. It was able to negotiate earlier access because it basically offered the pharmaceutical companies big trials of the vaccine. And so, first of all, Israel, it had an ongoing outbreak. So there was plenty of virus around. So it was a good place to offer these trials. It also had it had an integrated health data infrastructure. So basically, the Israeli government had a central database of everybody's health outcomes. We did not have that in New Zealand. We had, our system it was very devolved in those DHBs. If people cast their mind back to 2020, our health system was run by DHBs who all had their own different systems. So we didn't have a single health data system. We couldn't have offered that to the pharmaceutical companies. And even then, I think there were some ethical issues associated with just giving your data, giving your citizens' data over to pharmaceutical companies without consent. So even, I do think that there were some ethical concerns potentially around Israel doing that. But it did mean that they got early access to the vaccine. And of course, it was a very successful vaccine. So ultimately that decision by the Israeli government did save a lot of lives in Israel.
In terms of the disinformation that we saw around vaccines and the COVID response, and it sort of cropped up its own little cottage industry these days. We have, reality check radio, for example, is born out of people who were very anti these kind of mitigation factors. What's your kind of general overview on how come people don't seem to understand the processes or the sciences or the logic and reasoning behind the steps that we took and the outcomes that we were expected to get from those steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that happen. I mean, one is, actually New Zealanders did actually get vaccinated at a much higher rate than we thought. I remember talking to some of the Ministry of Health people sort of early 2021, and they were quite pessimistic, and they were kind of basing their expectations on our flu vaccine uptake, where even health professionals, only about 3/4 of health professionals regularly get the flu vaccine. So they were kind of basing their expectations on that, and so people did actually turn out, and so I think my take is that disinformation for most of us didn't have a big impact. But for a small number of people, maybe they've had negative experiences with the health system. I mean, the health system's certainly not perfect, and many people will have had disappointing experiences with the health system in different ways, and that might make you skeptical about a health system that's suddenly turning up with this magic bullet and insisting that you make use of it. So potentially that was. That created fertile ground for the for disinformation around the vaccine, and then I think that there was the US election that happened, Trump versus Biden, and so that became one of the wedge issues over there. Even though it's a bit strange because of course Trump was the one that poured all the money. It was his administration that poured all the money into developing the vaccine. But somehow it became a Republican versus Democrat issue. And so to this day, Republicans in the US are still much less likely to get vaccinated because of the distrust of the vaccine. And in fact, vaccine rates are plummeting in the US at the moment. And I think that created a motive really for people creating and spreading disinformation around the vaccine. It was essentially to try and influence the outcome of that election. And then that spilled over into New Zealand. And so we were being hit in the crossfire from a very divisive debate taking place in the US around that election, and which then had consequences for us. I mean, at the time, I guess I would describe myself as agnostic about the vaccine mandates. They were kind of hard. It was hard for me to, as a modeler, to tell whether they'd be that effective or not. I certainly I thought there was the potential for them being effective, but I wasn't sure about it, and I could see the potential for some downsides as well. So I was kind of a bit on the fence as whether they were the right tool at the time. In retrospect, they didn't work, and that's because Omicron came along, and Omicron it was able to evade the vaccine in terms of the infection blocking. So although the vaccine still protected you against having a severe case of COVID if you were exposed to Omicron, you were still quite likely to get infected, even if it was going to go on and be mild and infect other people. And the whole argument around the mandates was that it was infection blocking, so that we could effectively have spaces where we could be reasonably sure that people weren't carriers of the virus. That was the argument behind mandates. They were too slow to roll out, and by the time they were in place, which was sort of early 2021, we had Omicron. And against Omicron, the mandates were not effective. So I think my general conclusion is every time we sort of tried to construct this very targeted response, we were outflanked by the virus, right? The virus was changing enough that those very targeted responses were unless you could deploy them instantly, they generally weren't effective because the virus changed enough. Yeah.
With the impending pandemic of the future, because there's always one every 100 odd years or so, it seems, what can we do now to prepare for the next one?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the bad news is they're probably increasing in frequency. So we know that we're probably being exposed to these new viruses at the rate grows about 2 to 3% per year. And there's a couple of things going on. One is climate change, and that's displacing animals from their natural habitat. I mean, one of the big reservoirs for these types of viruses are bats. They carry millions of these viruses, and we've been exposed to just a tiny fraction of them. So our immune systems don't know anything about these viruses that live in bats. Climate change is meaning the bats are having to change their habitat as the climate shifts, and so we're coming into contact with them more often. And also, we're destroying more natural habitat quite deliberately. So as we do that, we're encountering these viruses more frequently. So I actually think we need to expect pandemics almost every decade now. They won't always be as severe as what we've just been through, and they won't always be as severe as the 1918 pandemic, which of course was very, very challenging for New Zealand. So we do need to start preparing now. One of the things I think we need to look to, and this is particularly watching what's happening in the US at the moment, where they really are dismantling their science system and public health system. That this points to a world where we're not going to be able to piggyback on what the Americans have been able to do in the past. I mean, we were very lucky that they put large amount of money into that vaccine development, their Project Lightspeed. That may not happen next pandemic. And so, how are we going to cope if we're not able to, or it becomes harder to access a vaccine? My suggestion is that we partner more closely with Australia. Australia does have some vaccine manufacturing capability, and it's actually ramping that up now. And so I think we should be a partner with the Australians around vaccines and around a lot of other aspects of our response. They actually had a very similar pandemic experience to us. It was probably tougher over there, to be honest. They spent more time in lockdown than we did, but they still went for that elimination strategy. And ultimately, our borders are quite strongly integrated as well. Our border control systems, we can travel visa-free to Australia, most of us as New Zealand citizens and residents. So it makes sense for us to sort of maintain a common pandemic stance and common pandemic preparedness. And so I think that would be my main suggestion is establishing deeper links with Australia. They've just set up an Australian Centre for Disease Control. I think we should be either co-investing in that centre with them, or basically building a sister agency here in New Zealand.
Oh, I was going to say just one last thing then, following on to that. Do we invest enough in the science here?
No, I mean that's across the board in science in New Zealand. We are towards the lower end of the OECD in terms of the money we put into our science system. So that's true of all our science, and I think we've probably not invested enough in infectious disease research as well. It's tended to be a much lower priority, and we've never sort of had a dedicated centre. My centre, Te Punaha Matatini, we were sort of had a much more general focus, even though that was one of the things we did. But we've never had a national centre whose focus was on infectious disease. So I think that's something that we should be doing here.
You talk about final 2 points from me. You talk about the next pandemic, right? And we see parties like Winston Peters pushing this COVID inquiry type thing. and then we've got the hospital system or the health system in general in a dire state at the moment. You've got commentators like Gary Payanda saying it's the best, it's the worst drama he's ever seen it. What do you think that brings in for a possible future pandemic when you've got people like Mr. Peters spreading disinformation, and then you've got the broken health system?
Yeah, I mean, like that's a real concern. Certainly, I mean, your health systems are not, no matter how good they are not going to cope with a pandemic. I mean, it's so your expectations that you could sort of just go on living as normal with any health system, that's not going to happen in a pandemic. The best equipped health systems in the world were overwhelmed when we were confronted with COVID, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be investing in our health system. We don't know the extent to which we'll be able to eliminate another virus again. I do think the elimination strategy is a good one for New Zealand because of our isolation. But if an influenza pandemic would be very hard to eliminate, and so preparing our health system it won't fully cope. It'll never fully get us out of trouble. But the more resilient it is, the better we'll fare in a pandemic. So certainly, I am concerned about the state of the health system and its ability to pivot, in particular, in facing a pandemic. The more resilient we can make our health system, the better, and that will require long-term investment in it, and infrastructure, people, and capability. So yeah, I am concerned, and I'd like to think we could have a not a polarized conversation about this, but a national conversation that really listens to everybody, and really leaves a legacy for the next generation that have to face a pandemic. If we can take from this experience the lessons that we learned and embed them in our health system for the future, I think our descendants will, and those that come after us, will thank us.
And what do you think about the current inquiry?
My verdict is out at the moment. I mean, I was actually very pleased with the first phase, the report from phase 1. I thought it was actually really good. I mean, it's not an easy read. It's 800 pages, so it's not your average person's bedtime reading. But there's a lot of good stuff in it. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see what comes out in the second report. I look back to 1918, and there were politics involved in the aftermath of the 1918 response, but there are a lot of good things that were done coming out of that. So you've always got people who will be political opportunists in these sorts of situations, but in the long run, you'd hope that common sense wins out over that political opportunism, and the legacy of today's our experiences today puts us in good stead for the future. So we'll see what comes out next year in the second report from the inquiry. But my general feeling, looking back at 1918, is that good sense will prevail over politics of the day.
Well, I want to say, unless Paul's got anything else.
Just one last question. Where can people find the book?
It's available at Bridget Williams online, so you can go order it, and they'll put it in the post to you. Or I think it's now out in most bookstores, Whitcoulls or Paper Plus, or your local independent bookstore would be good places to go look for it.
Cool, and a lot of my disabled friends have asked, is it going to be available on like audio form? Because a lot of us can't read, me included.
Yeah, it will be. There will be an ebook that you can then use some reading software for. Unfortunately, Bridget Williams is as an independent publisher, we can't. It's too expensive at the moment for us to do audiobooks. I would like to look into how we could fund an audiobook. And if there is someone listening out there who would like to give us a grant for that, we'd be willing to do it. But it's too expensive in the New Zealand market at the moment to make audiobooks, unfortunately. But it will be available in ebook format.
Fair enough. Thank you for joining us today, Shaun, and please stay with us.
I should put us back on screen so people can see us. So yeah, Professor Shaun Hendy, what were your thoughts on that particular interview?
So that interview was a little bit older, so I'm going to update a few bits here. So Shaun mentioned at the end of the interview that he would like to get it in audio form, but it's too expensive. If you want to buy it, you can go there. Thank you, Paul. And we are working together a little bit to see if there's a way we can turn it into an audio book for people who can't see. So, as he said, if anyone can help us, or if anyone watching tonight or listening to the audio version later knows someone that can help us, please reach out to me or Paul, and we'll get you in touch with Shaun and his. Yeah.
We've got people in the chat volunteering to take turns, dig out the microphone, do a chapter at a time, like one of those old school reading assignments. I think that could work.
Yeah, but all jokes aside, if anyone's listening or watching and wants to help, please reach out. We are serious about trying to get this.
The chat's been really interesting on this one, hearing about people's personal experiences during the pandemic. And it was hard for people, like at the height of the pandemic, and it is still ongoing. It's evolved. At the height, we were asked to do so much, and it was like a bit of a spinning top that was out of balance for some people, and that's completely understandable. I did ask after we finished recording whether or not I should go and get vaccinated, because I'm due for a booster. And he's like, yes, yep, it is still the best way to make sure that you don't get really, really sick. It might not necessarily stop transmission anymore like the earlier versions did, but it's still a really good way of making sure that your body is able to fight the virus, because the virus isn't going anywhere. But we've been very lucky in that the evolution of the virus has got to a point where it doesn't impact us anywhere near as bad as it did in that alpha strain. That alpha strain was 80,000 people that they predicted would die from it if it was just left to run rampant, the old plan B option for it. So yeah, that was kind of surprising. I also did a little bit of research into that whole shocking thing that Israel was really, really dodgy when it came to people's data and highly unethical. Who would have guessed Israel doing something unethical? But one of the things that came out just before the pandemic was the plan for us to amalgamate our healthcare systems. Because at the moment, our health records are what they call siloed. In every DHB, there's individual records, and if you get sick somewhere where your records aren't, they have to send for it, and it's a bit of a complicated system. That was actually part of the reason for creating that larger health system that incorporated the whole country, was to update those IT systems. And then, of course, COVID hit, and now the government turns around and says, well, this is all Labour's fault because you tried to update things during a pandemic. Yeah, fascinating learning curve.
And people have mentioned it in the chat, which is a good point. We are about a week and a half, 2 weeks away from Jacinta Ardern's big autobiography coming out. And that will be on audio form. I've ordered it already. So if you want to...
I should point out, yes, now Ian's right here. It's more accurate to say that it doesn't stop infection rather than transmission. Yeah, I'm not a scientician. I'm just a dumb fool with a camera.
So yeah, go and check that book out too, because it's meant to be amazing. I'll be
Yeah,
listening.
so the website's up there, bwb.co.nz, and you can actually just do a search by authors or by books. It's really easy to find. And he was wrong about the report, that the initial COVID report not being good bedtime reading. It put me out like that. It was really, really good bedtime reading.
So we've got the news left to go, and just one more reminder: join us tomorrow night for Jan to next.
Yep, so we've got Jan for tomorrow. We've got Priyanka for next Friday. If you're a paid up YouTube member, which you can do, you can sign up. It's really super easy. The interview with Shaun and this week's The News are already available for you to be able to watch before they go out public tomorrow at 7:30 in the morning for the news, and I think it's 10 o'clock for the interview with Shaun, which will also be available in audio version at the same time for people who want to listen to the podcast. Right, what's the news? This will be fun.
Yeah. Enjoy. We'll be back after.
In this week's episode, Brooke Van Velden tries to platform her charisma, uniqueness, nerve and talent. Abusive old man on the tiles says decorum in Parliament is slipping. Scathing reports from the Auditor General and UNESCO about the future for our children. And it's bye to another 70,000 New Zealanders. All that on this week's The News. Hello there, kia ora, I'm Paul, and welcome to this week's The News. It's been a week of bad language flying back and forward in Parliament and media around the use of a C word in an opinion piece by reporter Andrea Vance over the recent changes to pay equity laws passed under urgency last week. Labour leader Chris Hipkins, seen here drinking Conservative tears, has taken responsibility for the question asked in the House that Minister of Workplace Relations Brooke Van Velden used her response to apparently quote the article in the House. While Van Velden, seen here as Lady Demoiselle from Foundation, asked permission to use it in the context of a quote beforehand, the article did not use the actual word, simply implied it, and the article wasn't written by the Labour Party, but Van Velden blamed them for it. Said a spokesperson for the coalition, "You're not seeing pay equity in the headlines now, and isn't it nice that we finally recognise that different words in different contexts have different meanings?" Which we didn't believe when the Deputy Prime Minister got upset at a Green MP's Instagram page. Speaking of pay equity, with Thursday being Budget Day, pay equity is firmly focused in the minds of the public, with a public hui to be held on the grounds of Parliament that day. Supporters of the hui are asking for the bill to be rescinded and expect to descend on Parliament between 1 and 2 p.m. The main goals for the organisers include reversing the changes to the Act, overshadowed by Brooke's deliberate use of a term to cause outrage and distract, reinstate the 33 pay equity claims that they cancelled, and finding a way to finally fund and end pay equity gaps once and for all, said a spokesperson for the three men who run the government that voted for pay rises for themselves this week. "I'm sure if women can find time between the dishes and the laundry, they'll be there to support this." Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters, seen here looking for the bottle that was meant to be hidden under his desk, has spent the week raging, calling actions in the House recently a degradation of standards. The one coalition MP who will be getting a pay cut this year, Peters went on to say, "I don't use foul language in the House. It brings down the decorum of the institution. And it's totally different to when I said that we should worry about an Asian invasion, that two Wongs don't make a white, that there's no such thing as multiple Pacific Island nations, started harassing trans, queer and non-binary people, supported Trevor Mallard when he punched Toh Hinade, and used a homophobic term just yesterday when I said Chris Hipkins is a sausage eater who doesn't know a woman is paid less than a man." Te Pāti Māori MPs representing almost 23,000 voters are looking to be suspended from the House for the haka that broke out celebrating the end of the Treaty Principles Bill after the White Privileges Committee recommended the longest ever stand-down period on record of 3 weeks for the party's co-leaders. Under current rules governing Parliament, including an element of tikanga Māori in proceedings must first be given permission to go ahead by someone representing an old white man from a colonial power on the other side of the world. That representative, though, Jerry Brownlee, seen here showing you a shortcut through the airport, has warned MPs that he feels this punishment is disproportionate, being 7 times the length of the longest previous ban, and has said on Tuesday he will authorise open debate on the topic, meaning opposition MPs could use the event to filibuster and eventually delay the budget. The ACT Party, seen here trudging through the House with cowshit-covered gumboots, said it was about respecting the sanctity of Parliament, while the Prime Minister said of the situation, It's not like we put anything in the budget for those 23,000 voters anyway, so does it matter if they've got representation here or not? The Green Party this week released its alternative budget with a focus on evolving the economy to shift to a greener, fairer economy that looks after all its citizens, with promises of free doctors and dental care and the creation of a new public works department with a focus on the green sector. Economists have noted that this would keep debt levels within the Reserve Bank safety zone, which sees it as acceptable, with some saying it's very forward-thinking. The Prime Minister, seen here cosplaying as Ernst Stavros Blofeld, however, has taken umbrage at the inclusion of a jet tax, saying, "What I'm saying to you is, I used to run an airline," while Winston Peters, seen here trying his hand at prop comedy, called it Marxism with a printout for emphasis, saying, "My voters have no idea what Marxism really is, but think it's bad, so I'm calling it that to scare the gullible voters out there. And if people don't stop supporting the left, I'm going to be forced to call it communism, or even woke." While David Seymour, seen here with his own party's version of Donald Trump's friend Jeffrey Epstein, called it left-wing Trumpism after research found that politicians who push Trumpist ideologies keep losing at elections, and he didn't want to be tarred with that brush. The Auditor General has released a scathing report into Oranga Tamariki and its procedural changes put in place last year to slash budgets and pay for tax cuts and tobacco company kickbacks, because the changes did not consider the impact on children, which the Auditor General says is unacceptable since, that's the core function of the organisation. The changes were put in place in a rushed manner at the insistence of Children's Minister Karen Chow, seen here spotting a child succeeding, who said, "Yeah, those changes were forced last year, so it's all Labour's fault." Stats New Zealand's latest price tracking data has shown that food prices rose 3.7% annually last month, driven primarily by the costs of butter and dairy products, but seen across all 5 food groups that they monitor. Said the Prime Minister, seen here being forced to spend time with a poor person, "What I'm saying to you is we obviously have a laser focus on the cost of living in mansions paid for by your multiple rental incomes." In another report, Statistics New Zealand says Aotearoa New Zealand has seen its smallest net migration gain in more than 2 years, pointing out the flow of new migrants into the country has slowed, while a record 70,000 Kiwis left in the year to March, 2/3 of which went to Australia. Of those leaving, the majority were between 18 and 30 years old. ASB senior economist Mark Smith says this pattern reflects the weakening position of the New Zealand economy, while the Minister of Immigration, Erica Stanford, says, "Look, I'm glad they're going. It gives me more time to sort out my email and printer issues if there's less people migrating for me to worry about." Associate Education Minister and Snapchatter of 14-year-olds David Seymour has made a pre-budget announcement of $140 million for truancy services. Said the minister, seen here with someone who knows that school avoidance can be exacerbated by young people dealing with a range of outside issues that cause them harm. "Yes, we're cutting funding to truancy services, rolled back roles in the field last year, and even asked mayors to take over the role, which obviously is one of those core purposes of local government. So this is all their fault that we have to spend money on children and not tobacco companies." Health Minister Simeon Brown, seen here showing why he needs a car booster seat, has been caught out sending out a heavily redacted memo that Health New Zealand then released with no redactions that showed the minister is not only aware of the issues to the workforce in the health system by rushing surgeries through private hospitals, which would lead to further degradation of the public health system, he seems to be actively encouraging it. Said the minister, "I don't see a problem here. I'll be sorted if we make everything private." It's been discovered by local democracy reporters that the government will be removing funding for 113 kaiawhina, or support staff, dedicated for one-to-one patient care in our hospitals and medical facilities in support around the country in this year's upcoming budget. Said Nicola Willis, Finance Minister, "We know we promised budget cuts wouldn't impact frontline services, but these have a Māori name, so they don't count." A new report from accounting and business advisory firm Baker Tilly has found that despite tax cuts in last year's budget, New Zealanders are now paying an average of 4.66% more tax than they did a year ago. The drivers for this include increased prices on essentials like food, power and car registration, with every price increase seeing an incremental increase in GST take, as well as an increased cost for rates that have jumped 11% in the last 12 months as councils grapple with increased costs and ongoing issues, like water infrastructure and the tail end of high inflation. said finance spokesperson Nicola Willis. See, laser focus. An external review initiated by ACT MP Nicole McKee, seen here realising that the public don't want gun access to be too easy, into the safety outcomes of the firearms registry started in the wake of the Christchurch terror attack, has found that the registry is doing exactly as it was intended and is working as expected. A spokesperson for the police said that the registry was 2 years into a 5-year plan and it was already delivering results on keeping guns off streets and keeping people safe, even if the minister herself hasn't registered on it yet. In response, Nicole McKee claimed that the report was wrong, that experts clearly don't know what they're talking about, and that we won't be properly safe from gun violence until every child has a handgun under their pillow and their parents have several questionable firearms buried in their backyard. The government has admitted that they got it wrong. Sorry, only on one thing, not on everything that they've clearly got wrong. They've admitted that the Family Start system, which requires manual entry and has only been fully reimbursed to 259 families since it started, has used a quarter of its funding on administration costs and have said that this was due to errors on their behalf. Said Nicola Willis, seen here daydreaming about the upset public servants losing their jobs to pay for her tax cuts. It's very expensive to rush things instead of waiting to build an automated integrated system that would have done this with precision and reduced admin costs. But no matter how many times people told me that, well, I clearly didn't listen to them because they're poor. A week after law changes pushed through under urgency, making it easier to kill native animals like the kiwi, the Department of Conservation has announced another 68 roles are to be removed to reach the government's goals of tax cuts for landlords, meaning that one guy named Barry living in a central Otago hut will now be the entire Department of Conservation workforce. New research into the drug habits of New Zealanders has found that online shopping is the way of the future. The New Zealand Drug Survey undertakes annual research into trends of drug usage and distribution and has found that the online sales have been increasing, especially through social media. It's increased between 100 and 250% in the past 5 years. Said Police Minister Mark Mitchell, seen here teaching new cops the importance of always blowing on the pie. Naturally, we're very concerned about this and we'll do everything we can to reduce the harm caused by these substances. Except properly funding customs, making pseudoephedrine illegal, legalising and regulating marijuana like we do with tobacco, properly fund addiction services and community outreach programs, will deal with the drivers of poverty, which are seen as drivers for drug use. Because that's what we mean by being tough on crime. A new report from UNICEF has ranked New Zealand 32nd out of 36 wealthy countries in global youth well-being markers. The report found that the country has the highest youth suicide rates of any of the 36 measured, 3 times the average rate, with Māori, rainbow and disabled youth experiencing disproportionately high rates of attempted suicide and bullying still remaining widespread. Social Development Minister Louise Upston, seen here being told stuff framed this article to make it look like she wanted to harm more kids, has called the numbers disappointing and said we must do better to improve the lives of young Kiwis. And having a government that vilifies Māori, considers disabled people a burden and openly encourages anti-rainbow rhetoric is the only way to do that because, that's how we fix the economy. And finally, Tauranga Mayor Mahi Drysdale, seen here wondering where he is today, has finally purchased a home in the place that he is mayor of, having purchased a property in Papamoa, with plans to move his whānau over from Cambridge at the end of the school year to avoid disruption in their education. It's not uncommon for local body elected members to live outside the areas that they represent, but Drysdale was one of the furthest away from the place he was elected to, second only to Hamilton City Council's Andrew Bidder and Southland District Council's Jaspreet Boparai, who live on another planet and are completely detached from our reality. Right, that's this week's The News. Live long, prosper, look after yourself, and we will catch you guys all next week. That's this week's The News. Now, I'm just going to answer a quick question here that came up in the chat from Not Bernadette. I haven't covered this one yet because I'm still looking into details. I only saw the announcement this morning, and it's a lot to get my head around. As I said before, I'm really bad with numbers. So I'm trying to understand exactly what it is that they're proposing and what they want to do and just how shitty it's going to be. And to be honest, we'll probably just get a guest on who is much, much better explaining these things to me so I can get my head around it.
I forgot to mention earlier, tomorrow night the whole team will be here. Nick will be here.
You got Nick Ruani, Rebecca Graham, you will be here. I might even make it. and of course, Jan Tanetti. So lots of people.
So this is going to be a whole team affair. And it's promising to be juicy.
Yes,
not one
people
of us.
should be here for that. Lots of fireworks.
Yeah.
Lots
So,
of fireworks.
On that note, unless for one to say anything else.
No, thank you very much for joining us tonight, everyone. Really appreciate all the feedback and comments, and those that hit the like and hug, and what I got, a like, a heart, a hug. And there was one comment that came through on Facebook that I need to go and explore now, because there was lots of swearies and fingers being pulled and stuff like that on it. So I'm going to go do some moderation.
Yeah, see you tomorrow night with Jan Tanetti, everybody.
Catch you
Bye.
then.